Yeah, so there's a growing body of evidence that you can think of politics as its own kind of unique chronic stressors, and just like other things that would cause us to have chronic stress in our lives, the impact of that can be quite negative. So we know certainly increased anxiety, depression, with those who tend to fixate more on politics. But we're also, just like we already know that chronic stress can impact us physically, we're seeing that politics may also be a unique stressor that can impact our physical health as well. So things like headaches have been reported, things like insomnia as well. And of course, there's also some social impact as well, most likely in the form of like fractured or damaged relationships. My top five are going to be, first of all, accepting and acknowledging the emotions that you have about the political landscape and when you're triggered about politics. Another thing that you can do is engage in more mindful media consumption, whether it be with the news or with social media, which we know we get a lot of news from these days. Another thing would be to communicate healthy boundaries in all of the relationships that a person has about politics. Pivoting to action and agency. So what is in a person's control when it comes to politics, because we know that there's a lot that isn't in our control. And another thing would be to really respect, or let me say, practice respecting different perspectives. So this one is really important because one interesting thing that we see in the research literature is that when people try to avoid their feelings about politics and they try to kind of push those emotions aside, or they avoid trying to look at media altogether about politics, we see this interesting phenomena where they actually just disengage altogether. And what happens there is that they're not participating in a civic manner, right? They're not active participants in civic landscape. And that's problematic because that's not great for democracy and probably not great for the country. So we don't want to shut down our feelings altogether about politics because we have emotions for a reason. And oftentimes those emotions can lead us to take positive civic action, which I can certainly talk about later. So instead of just trying to avoid politics altogether, kind of bury your head in the sand, what I recommend is that when you are in a political conversation or you do see a headline that kind of triggers you emotionally, that you just simply label the emotion you're feeling. A lot of times that's anxiety. Many times it could be anger, but whatever it is, kind of acknowledging that, describing it to yourself, and really just practicing acceptance of that feeling rather than trying to get rid of it. So that could look like something like, well, it makes sense that I'm anxious, right? There's a lot of uncertainty in this political landscape right now. Or it makes sense that I feel angry. This person has a very different viewpoint from me and it's not consistent with my values. Something that I think is really important, again, to emphasize is that I never recommend just avoiding media altogether. And in fact, it would be impossible. The landscape that we're getting our information in has really fundamentally changed. People are no longer just getting their political news with a newspaper in the morning with their coffee, right? We're getting a 24-hour news cycle. You really have that in the palm of your hand, in your pocket at all times. You're going to be bombarded with politics. And I will say that social media, right, becomes extremely saturated with political content in election years. So we are approaching that time as we speak, where you're going to see a lot more political content in social media. So we're not trying to avoid it altogether, nor can we, but what we want to do is set some boundaries around our media consumption. Some ways that you might consider doing that: you could perhaps, read a text newsletter of your choice, of your kind of respected news source that you enjoy consuming, and you might just dedicate like 15 to 30 minutes a day that you're going to catch up on that text news source. And I say text because you tend to be bombarded with fewer triggering or upsetting images, and so sometimes text can be better for emotional well-being. So that's something to consider. Another Another thing that people could consider is simply disengaging from or deleting social media accounts as we lead up to an election. So there was actually a pretty good study about this that was done leading up to the 2018 midterms, where individuals who deleted a certain social media account in the 4 weeks prior to that election tended to have better emotional well-being compared to those who did not deactivate or delete their accounts. So you could go that extreme, or you could simply limit, hey, I'm only going to go into this app when I have a specific thing that I want to look at or get information. So it's really what's going to work for you, but what we don't want to see is what you've probably heard of doom scrolling, because the algorithms for social media do just tend to show us more of what we've already looked at or clicked on. Those are called filter bubbles. So you're just going to see more and more of content. And sometimes that can just be very saturated and upsetting for people. So you do want to give yourself a break. So this is something that I think there could be a range, a spectrum of what you are willing to talk about or tolerate depending on the relationship. So one thing that I would say is really have in mind, how much you are willing to talk about politics with kind of each individual person, right? So this matters because the closer or the more important the relationship, the more you probably are going to want to be more willing to engage or at least consider where you can find your common ground, as opposed to maybe it's not that important to have a deep political conversation with a barista. Regardless of, or your barista, but regardless of the relationship that you have with the person, there are many things that you can do to communicate healthy boundaries of what you are and are not willing to talk about when it comes to politics. One thing is just to make sure you're setting clear limits. That could look something along the lines of, talking about politics tends to stress me out. I'd really prefer that we talk about something else right now. And you can say that very politely, but firmly. A lot of people think that if you set a clear limit, you're being rude. But you could certainly set that limit while being respectful and polite to the other person. Sometimes the best course of action is to just have a ground rule of not discussing politics at all. We all have those people in our lives that we know it just never tends to go well. So it is completely fine to designate no political discussion zones, right? So just no politics zones, and really lay that out in a way that we are being respectful to the other person. Again, setting that clear limit of, talking about politics is not something that I want to do. Can we just shift the topic or talk about something different? And that's completely reasonable as well. Redirection is another strategy where, let's say you're feeling a little shy to set that firm boundary. You can at least say, hey, how's your grandmother doing? Or really shift that conversation to a completely different topic. And that can be a little more of a, less outright kind of way of doing things. Yeah, so one thing that we know is that active civic participation about causes that we really care about does tend to have a positive impact on our emotional and potentially even physical well-being due to the emotional benefits. So it's not great for us to stick our heads in the sand, and it's not great for the democracy when we don't participate, and probably not great for the country. So in terms of some ideas for how to channel that political stress into civic participation or into causes that aligns with one's values, some things that a person might consider would be simply to vote, right? That's probably the most simple one that someone could start with, is that they can get their vote in and get their vote counted, and certainly always encourage people to vote. Another thing that people can do is to donate money. If they have financial means, they could donate to the campaign of their choice and the campaign that they are passionate about. They could volunteer their time for campaigns, right? So they could, if they don't have the financial means, they could volunteer time. Another thing that they could do is to, get involved in local community causes that are important to them and that align with their values. Whether it's helping get people out to vote, working at the polls, or other things like that. So volunteering is really big, and what's really great about volunteer work is we know that it actually has a lot of well-being benefits of its own, and perhaps people who volunteer frequently even live longer. So it may have longevity benefits as well. So one of the reasons that it's important to respect different perspectives is for relationship preservation. Now, some relationships may be way more worth it to us than others. So visiting the grandmother that you only see once a year and politics come up, well, you're probably going to be much more inclined to respect, that kind of perspective from grandma, because preserving that relationship may be very important to you, right? When we don't respect the opinions of others and we keep trying to change their mind or kind of barrel them over the head with why they should vote for the candidate we're voting for, it can damage relationships. And the other important thing is that think of how many times you've tried to convince anyone in your life to vote for the opposing candidate, and how many times has that worked? And how many times has someone tried to convince you to vote for the opposing candidate and it changed your mind, right? So the majority of the time, we are not going to be changing anyone's mind. So in terms of what can we do to respect others' opinions, the first thing is to change our mindset entirely. Do not go into a conversation with the goal of persuading another person to vote for the candidate you plan to vote for. Let's just go ahead and take that off the table. Instead, let's go into conversations with curiosity, trying to understand the viewpoint of the other person. So I try to avoid asking why, right? Or how could you possibly? So we want to avoid phrases like that and instead say, can you tell me a little bit about your perspective? Tell me more about that. That's really interesting. So we want to try to avoid those kind of accusatory questions. But the biggest thing always comes down to curiosity. That's the lens that we're going into this with. And this will enable us to not walk away with fractured relationships, damaged relationships, or just a very smaller social circle after this year's election, but hopefully to still maintain some of those relationships. And I will add that that's how we can be a part of reducing the polarization of politics that we have seen in this country over the years, right? We're highly polarized and divisive political landscape right now. So if you want to be a part of changing that, it does involve respecting other people's opinions and perspectives.